Wyoming Territory, 1876, a land where dreams could shatter like glass against stone, where promise and peril walked the same winding trails across the untamed frontier. For the Richardson family, the Wyoming wilderness represented hope, a chance to claim land under the Homestead Act and build something permanent away from the crowded, soot-stained streets of Philadelphia. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 11-year-old Abigail Richardson had spent 3 months watching the landscape transform from lush eastern woodlands to endless prairies, and finally to the imposing silhouettes of the Bighorn Mountains. The Caldwell wagon train, 24 settlers, bound by shared ambition and desperate optimism, had welcomed the Richardsons despite their last-minute addition to the expedition. No one could have anticipated the horror that awaited them in the shadow of those magnificent peaks. The morning. Frost clung to the tall grass surrounding their campsite as Abigail collected firewood along the perimeter. Dawn had barely broken, the sky shifting from inky darkness to pale lavender, promising another crisp autumn day. The covered wagons formed their customary circle, a fragile barrier against the wilderness beyond. Most travelers remained asleep, except for Captain Caldwell himself, who had taken the final watch. Abigail's nimble fingers moved methodically, gathering dry branches for the breakfast fire. Her mind wandered to the charcoal sketch her father had promised to help her complete. For her younger brother's birthday, little Samuel would be turning 6 tomorrow, and despite months of difficult travel, their mother had preserved a small tin of peaches to mark the occasion. Such simple pleasures seemed monumental after the hardships they'd endured on the trail. "That should be plenty, Abby," Captain Caldwell called softly, his weather-beaten face crinkling with kindness. "Your mother will be wanting that soon to start the morning meal." Abigail nodded, collecting her bundle. At 11 years old, she took pride in contributing to the daily labor of survival. 3 months on the trail had transformed her from a sheltered city child into someone who understood the rhythms of frontier life. The constant work, the satisfaction of self-reliance, the brief moments of beauty amid struggle. The first gunshot tore through that rhythm like lightning through calm skies. Abigail instinctively dropped to the ground, the kindling scattering from her arms. More shots followed, then screams, high, terrified sounds that sent ice through her small frame. Through the tall grass, she could see riders charging into the circle of wagons. At least 12 men with bandanas pulled over their faces, firing indiscriminately into the camp. Captain Caldwell's warning shout was cut short by a bullet. The old guide collapsed near the main campfire, his rifle unfired beside him. The Mitchell family scrambled from their wagon, Mr. Mitchell pushing his wife and daughter toward a small ravine behind them. A rider spotted them, wheeled his horse around, and cut them down before they made it 30 yards, their bodies falling in a terrible heap, nightclothes darkening with crimson in the strengthening dawn light. Abigail pressed herself flat against the earth, one hand covering her mouth to stifle her sobs. She was nearly 60 yards from the nearest wagon, concealed in the high grass that bordered their campsite. The massacre unfolded with horrific clarity. Mrs. Turner dragged screaming from her wagon, the Garfield brothers gunned down as they tried to reach their father's shotgun, a baby wailing until its cries were suddenly, sickeningly silenced. Raiders moved with terrible efficiency, killing first, then looting. They took only what was valuable and easily transported: money, jewelry, weapons. They didn't bother with food stores or personal effects. This wasn't desperation. It was calculated. "Brutality! Check the perimeter," a deep voice commanded. "Make sure we got them all." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She inched backward through the grass, moving with agonizing slowness away from camp. The morning dew soaked through her dress, the earth's chill seeping into her bones. 20. Yards 40. The sounds of destruction continued behind her. When she judged herself far enough away, Abigail risked rising to a crouch. The grass stood taller than her bent form, providing cover as she navigated toward a stand of pines that lined a nearby stream. Each step was torture, her small body trembling so violently she feared the movement might give away her position. Horse whinnied uncomfortably close. Abigail froze. "Nothing over here, Rayburn," a voice called, no more than 20 yards from where she stood, immobilized with terror. "Get back here, then. We're burning the wagons." Abigail remained motionless until the hoofbeats receded, then continued her painstaking retreat toward the trees. By the time she reached the pines, black smoke billowed into the morning sky. The raiders had set fire to the wagons, erasing evidence of their specific crimes, though not the broader atrocity. From the relative safety of the trees, Abigail watched as the murderers mounted up and rode northwest, their saddlebags heavy with stolen valuables. Only when they disappeared over a distant ridge did she allow herself to collapse against a tree trunk, her small body convulsing with silent sobs. Hours passed before she found the courage to return to what remained of the camp. The wagons still, smoldered, reduced to blackened frames and ash. Bodies lay where they had fallen, their vacant eyes staring skyward. Abigail moved among them like a ghost, searching desperately for her family. She found her father first, fallen near their wagon, with his hunting knife still in his hand. He had managed to wound at least one attacker, based on the blood trail that led away from his body. Her mother lay nearby, her body curved protectively around Samuel, her little brother's small wooden horse still clutched in his tiny hand. There, stillness told Abigail everything her 11-year-old mind didn't want to accept. In a haze of shock, she gathered what supplies she could salvage. A canteen half full of water, her father's hunting knife, a singed blanket, and a small tin of matches from the cook wagon. She couldn't bring herself to take anything else from the dead. The enormity of her predicament settled over her as she stood amid the devastation. She was alone, a child in hostile territory, at least 50 miles from the nearest settlement. Winter came early to these mountains. If the elements didn't kill her, starvation would. Or perhaps the raiders would return to ensure no witnesses remained. Yet beneath the crushing weight of circumstance, something hardened in young Abigail Richardson. Her father's words from the previous night echoed in her mind. "Remember, Abby, a girl, Richardsons don't surrender. We face our troubles and push through." With the meager supplies bundled into the blanket, Abigail studied her surroundings. The Caldwell train had been following the Powder River northward, planning to connect with a larger trail that would take them west to their land claims. Logic dictated she should continue north toward the outpost at Fort Kearny, but the raiders had ridden northwest. North would be the first place they'd look if they suspected a survivor. Abigail turned her face eastward toward the mountains her father had pointed out days earlier, the Bighorns, with peaks that captured the morning light like ancient sentinels. Rough country, he'd said, but full of game and hidden valleys. Something about those mountains called to her now, not just the promise of concealment, but of height. From those peaks she might see for miles, might spot approaching danger before it found her. She took a final look at the charred remains of the camp, silently promising her family that she would survive to tell of what happened here. Then, with the sun high overhead, Abigail turned her face eastward and began to walk. The first day passed in a fog of shock and physical strain. Abigail forced herself to move at a steady pace, rationing sips from the canteen, gathering berries where she found them growing alongside animal trails. As dusk approached, she sought shelter beneath an outcropping of rock, wrapping herself in the salvaged blanket against the mountain night's bitter cold. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares of the morning's horror and the very Real sounds of wildlife moving in the darkness beyond her shallow cave. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries echoing off the mountainsides. Dawn brought no comfort, only the stark reality of another day of survival. Abigail's feet, encased in sturdy but worn boots, developed painful blisters that burst and reformed with each mile. Her small pack, made from the blanket, grew heavier as the day progressed, though it contained almost nothing. The meager rations she had salvaged would last perhaps another day, if carefully measured. Yet she pressed on, following game trails, upward, counting each step as a small victory against death. By the third day, Abigail's situation had grown dire. The canteen held only a few precious swallows, though the mountain streams provided abundant water when she could safely reach their banks. Food was the greater concern. She had finished the last of her salvaged supplies that morning and had found little to forage along the day's journey. Hunger gnawed at her insides, making her steps unsteady and her thoughts increasingly muddled. The weather, too, had turned against her. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains, bringing an unseasonable cold front down from the north. The first raindrops hit as Abigail struggled up a rocky slope. Within minutes, the drizzle became a downpour. Her clothes, already tattered from days of wilderness travel, offered little protection against the deluge. The blanket wrapped around her shoulders grew sodden and heavy. Her hair hung in dripping tendrils around her face, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Keep moving," she commanded herself. "Just keep moving." But toward what? The question haunted her with increasing urgency. Fort Kearny remained days away, perhaps a week at her current pace. In her weakened state, with dwindling resources and worsening weather, the odds of reaching it diminished with each passing hour. As afternoon faded toward evening, the rain finally relented, though the skies remained threatening. Abigail found herself on a high ridge overlooking a deeply carved valley. The terrain ahead appeared increasingly steep and broken, less hospitable than the slopes she had already traversed. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Abigail gripped a boulder, waiting for it to pass. When it didn't, when in fact it intensified, a new fear took hold. Her vision began to blur at the edges. The distant mountains seemed to waver and dance. When the spell subsided slightly, Abigail raised her head and studied the broken landscape ahead. Continuing blindly forward no longer seemed possible. She needed shelter, a place to recover her strength before the coming night brought even colder temperatures. It was then that she noticed the narrow opening in the ridgeline just 40 yards ahead, a dark shadow against the grey stone that suggested a cave, or at least a deep overhang. With renewed purpose, she forced her trembling legs to carry her forward. The opening proved to be the entrance to a small cave, no more than 20 feet deep, but blessedly dry. The floor was sandy, with scattered stones, the ceiling high enough for her to stand upright. Most importantly, the entrance was partially screened by a stunted pine, making it all but invisible from more than a few yards away. Abigail collapsed inside, her strength completely spent. The soggy blanket offered meager protection against the cave's chill, but at least she was out of the wind and rain. She curled into herself, shivering uncontrollably, her mind clouding with the combined effects of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. "Just for tonight," she whispered to herself. "Just rest tonight and keep moving tomorrow." But as darkness claimed the mountain and the temperature plummeted further, a new realization formed in her exhausted mind. This cave offered something she desperately needed, not just shelter for a night, but security. From its recessed entrance, she could see approaching danger without being seen. The forest below provided both concealment and potential food sources. A small stream trickled just 20 yards downslope, offering clean water. Perhaps, she thought as consciousness began to fade, The wisest path wasn't to keep moving blindly forward, but to secure a defensible position, to build strength, to survive long enough for help to arrive, or for the raiders to abandon their search, assuming they even suspected a survivor. "I'll stay," she murmured, the decision crystallizing as sleep overtook her. "Just until I'm stronger, just until it's safe." She couldn't have known, as consciousness fled, that this simple decision born of desperation and childish logic would shape the coming months in ways she could never have imagined. That her temporary refuge would become a prison of fear and isolation. That the cave on the mountainside would both preserve her life and slowly erode her humanity. Or that the charcoal stick she'd unconsciously kept from her brother's birthday gift would become both her salvation and the fragile thread connecting her to a stranger whose own life had been shaped by similar violence. A Lakota scout with reasons of his own to hunt the men who had destroyed everything Abigail Richardson had ever known. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. Abigail's temporary shelter had become a permanent refuge against the increasingly harsh winter. Her initial panic had transformed into a rigid routine of survival that sustained her body, while her spirit retreated deeper into itself. The cave now bore the markings of extended habitation. A crude door of interwoven pine branches covered the entrance, keeping out the worst of the mountain wind. Inside, a bed of dried grasses and pine needles occupied the deepest recess. A small fire pit sat near the entrance, positioned so that smoke would drift outward rather than filling the cave. Stacks of firewood lined one wall, while roots, dried berries, and strips of smoked meat hung from a makeshift rack fashioned from stripped branches. November had brought heavy snow to the Bighorn Mountains, blanketing the landscape in treacherous beauty. The white expanse made travel nearly impossible, but it also granted Abigail an unexpected gift: the ability to spot tracks around her sanctuary. Each morning she carefully swept away any sign of her presence and studied the area for prints that weren't her own. So far, only deer, rabbits, and the occasional mountain lion had passed near her hiding place. Of the raiders, there had been no sign since that first terrible day. Abigail had changed in ways both visible and hidden. Her once soft hands had grown calloused from gathering firewood and crafting primitive tools. Her face, once round with childhood softness, had thinned, revealing cheekbones that mirrored her late mother's. Her clothing, patched with strips of rabbit fur and pine bark fiber, hung loosely on her frame, despite her efforts to maintain her strength. The most profound changes, however, lay beneath the surface. The talkative, curious girl who had left Philadelphia with wide-eyed excitement had receded into watchful silence. Even alone, she rarely spoke aloud, as if her voice itself might betray her location. Her movements had acquired a predator's stealth, her ears attuned to the subtlest sounds of the forest. She had become a creature of the wilderness, more comfortable with the company of squirrels and jays than with memories of human interaction. Today marked the beginning of January, or so Abigail calculated by the notches carved in a stick beside her bed. 2 full moons had passed since the massacre. 2 months of solitude, of walking the knife edge between survival and surrender. The morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Abigail's breath hung visible in the air inside her cave as she carefully banked the embers of her small night fire. Winter had depleted her stores faster than anticipated, and today she would need to venture farther than usual to check her snares and gather what meager food the frozen forest might offer. She pulled on layers of clothing, her original dress, now reinforced with fur linings, covered by a crude poncho made from the salvaged blanket. Her feet were wrapped in rabbit skins inside her increasingly fragile boots. Her father's hunting knife hung at her waist, its blade worn from constant use but still serviceable. From a leather thong around her neck hung a small wooden horse, her brother's toy, the only personal item she had allowed herself to keep. Abigail stepped from the cave into the brilliant morning, momentarily blinded by sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. She secured the pine bough door behind her, then carefully began to obscure her tracks as she moved downslope toward her nearest snares. The first 2 traps were empty, the third disturbed by some larger predator that had stolen her catch. The fourth, set in a sheltered hollow where tender shoots still pushed through the snow, held a small rabbit. Abigail whispered a word of thanks as she freed the animal from the snare and swiftly ended its suffering. The rabbit was thin, but its meat would sustain her for 2 days at least, and its fur would repair the increasingly worn lining of her mittens. She was checking her 5th and final trap when she noticed something that froze her blood, a set of tracks that didn't belong to any animal she recognized. Human tracks, boot prints, and they were fresh, cut clearly into the morning's new snow. Abigail dropped to a crouch behind a fallen log, her heart hammering against her ribs. For long minutes she remained motionless, scanning the forest with the intensity of prey, sensing a predator. The forest maintained its winter stillness, giving no sign of the intruder's presence or direction. The tracks led toward the stream, where she gathered water, then continued upstream toward the neighboring valley. They weren't the military style, boots worn by the raiders, but rather the distinctive imprint of moccasins with hardened soles, the footwear of someone who walked the mountains regularly, someone familiar with the terrain. A trapper, perhaps, or a native scout. Neither possibility offered comfort. Trappers were often rough men who lived beyond the reach of law, while relations between settlers and native tribes remained tense throughout the territory. Anyone finding a white child alone in these mountains would ask questions she couldn't safely answer. Abigail backed away from the tracks, abandoning her final trap unchecked. She moved with painful caution, taking a circuitous route back to her cave, doubling back multiple times to ensure she wasn't followed. She paused frequently to listen, straining her ears for any sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. By the time she reached her sanctuary, the winter sun had passed its zenith. She slipped inside, securing the door more thoroughly than usual, then retreated to the deepest shadows of the cave. Her hands trembled as she skinned the rabbit, her mind racing with newfound fear. 2 months of vigilance, and now this. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was searching these mountains deliberately. That night, Abigail didn't light her fire, despite the biting cold. She wrapped herself in every layer of clothing and fur she possessed, and huddled in darkness, listening to the wind moan through the pines outside. Sleep evaded her entirely, her mind conjuring scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. The next morning brought heavy clouds and the promise of more snow. Abigail ventured out only far enough to confirm that no fresh tracks surrounded her cave, then retreated inside to wait out the coming storm. The snowfall began mid-morning, a gentle curtain that gradually transformed into driving sheets of white. By evening, nearly a foot of fresh powder had accumulated, effectively erasing all signs of human passage from the mountainside. For 3 days, the storm raged, delivering the heaviest snowfall Abigail had experienced since seeking refuge in the mountains. When the skies finally cleared, the landscape had been transformed into an alien terrain of deep drifts and buried landmarks. Moving through this new topography would be exhausting and dangerous, but it also granted a temporary reprieve from discovery. No one, regardless of their tracking skill, could follow her now buried trail. Nevertheless, Abigail redoubled her precautions. She ventured from the cave only when absolutely necessary, abandoned her more distant snares, and gathered water from a small seep inside a rock crevice rather than visiting the stream. She maintained her vigilance, studying the area around her shelter each morning and evening for any sign of intrusion. For 2 weeks, she detected nothing unusual. The boot prints remained buried beneath layers of snow and ice, and no new tracks appeared in the vicinity of her shelter. Gradually, Abigail began to extend her movements again, driven by the increasing scarcity of food in her immediate surroundings. It was during these confined days that Abigail discovered an unexpected outlet for her fear and loneliness. Among the few treasures she had managed to salvage from the burned wagons was a small bundle of charcoal sticks her father had promised would become part of Samuel's birthday gift, materials for drawing that had somehow survived the flames. In the dim light of her cave, she began to sketch on the smooth stone walls. At first, her drawings were simple, blocky representations of rabbits, trees, the mountains as seen from her cave entrance. As the weeks passed, however, her skill improved dramatically. Having nothing but time and isolation, she poured herself into the artwork, discovering that the act of creation provided a precious escape from the grinding reality of survival. The cave walls slowly filled with increasingly sophisticated images. She drew her family as she remembered them, her father's strong hands, her mother's gentle smile, Samuel's mischievous eyes. She recreated scenes from their journey west, the crossing of the Mississippi, camp life on the plains, the breathtaking first sight of the Bighorn Mountains rising from the horizon. And then, driven by some need she couldn't fully articulate, she began to document the massacre, not in graphic detail, but in symbolic representations. Faceless riders emerging from morning mist, wagons engulfed in stylized flames, a small figure watching from tall grass. These darker images she created in the deepest recesses of the cave, as if even in isolation she feared someone might witness this visual testimony. Most significantly, she drew the faces of the attackers, those few she had glimpsed clearly enough to remember. The man called Rayburn, with his distinctive scar running along his jawline, the heavy-set rider whose bandana had slipped, revealing a bushy red beard, the leader whose cold eyes had surveyed the carnage with a chilling detachment. These portraits she rendered with particular care, working from memory, refining each detail until the likenesses seemed to stare back at her from the stone. The drawings served multiple purposes. They preserved memories that might otherwise fade, provided distracting focus during the long winter nights, and most practically, helped Abigail maintain her fragile grip on sanity. In a world stripped of human connection, these silent companions populated her solitude. By mid-February, Abigail's situation had grown increasingly precarious. Her food stores had dwindled to almost nothing, her strength diminishing with each passing day. The winter had proven harsher than normal, according to her father's earlier predictions, with temperatures that regularly plunged well below freezing, and storms that made hunting nearly impossible. She had become adept at stretching her meager resources, making broth from bones that she would normally have discarded, carefully rationing each morsel of dried meat, supplementing her diet with pine needle tea that provided some relief from the constant hunger. But such measures could only extend her supplies, not replenish them. Today's hunt had yielded nothing. Her snares stood empty, the wild animals as desperate and scarce as her own resources. Returning to her cave empty-handed, Abigail faced the stark reality that she might not survive until spring. The thought should have terrified her, but instead brought a strange calm. If death came, at least it would end the crushing loneliness, the constant vigilance, the gnawing hunger that had become her constant companions. As twilight approached, she sat at the mouth of her cave, watching as the setting sun painted the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. The beauty of it struck her with unexpected force, and she found herself reaching for her charcoal sticks, driven to capture this moment of tranquil splendor before darkness claimed it. Abigail worked quickly, her cold, stiffened fingers moving, across a relatively flat section of the cave wall near the entrance. The resulting image was perhaps her finest yet, a panoramic view of the valley below, rendered with surprising sensitivity for an 11-year-old artist. The emotional quality of the piece transcended mere technical skill, somehow capturing both the majesty of the landscape and the profound isolation of the observer. As she added the final details, subtle shadings to suggest the lengthening shadows across the snow, a sound from outside froze her in place. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps on snow, deliberate and measured, approaching the hidden entrance to her cave. Panic surged through her. She retreated to the deepest part of the cave, grabbing her father's hunting knife with trembling hands. The footsteps stopped directly outside. A moment of terrible silence followed. Then the pine bough door moved slightly, allowing a shaft of late afternoon light to penetrate the dimness. A figure stood silhouetted in the narrow opening, tall, broad-shouldered, distinctly male. As he ducked to enter the low cave mouth, features became visible: copper skin, high cheekbones, dark eyes that swept the interior with predatory intensity. He wore buckskins and a fur-lined jacket, with hair braided and adorned with small beads. A knife hung at his belt, and he carried a bow slung across his back. Lakota. The knowledge came from stories told around campfires, descriptions of the proud people who roamed these territories. Stories that white settlers shared with equal measures of fear and fascination. The warrior stood motionless just inside the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness. Abigail pressed herself against the far wall, knife extended, knowing it would provide little defense against this intruder. Her heart pounded so violently she felt certain he must hear it echoing through the small space. Then his attention shifted from her to the walls around them. His expression changed from wary alertness to something more complex: surprise, curiosity, and what might have been reluctant admiration. He studied the drawings that covered nearly every surface, lingering on the panoramic landscape she had just completed. When his gaze finally returned to Abigail, something had shifted in his demeanor. He made no move toward her, instead lowering himself to a crouch that made him seem less threatening while keeping a respectful distance. "You draw these?" he asked, in accented but clear English, gesturing to the charcoal images. The question was so unexpected, so mundane amidst the extraordinary circumstances, that Abigail found herself responding despite her terror. "Yes," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. The warrior nodded thoughtfully, his eyes drawn again to the massacre scenes in the deeper recesses of the cave. He studied the rendered faces of the attackers with particular intensity. "Rayburn," he said suddenly, pointing to the scarred face she had drawn with such care. "You know this man." The recognition sent ice through Abigail's veins. This warrior knew the raiders, but as ally or enemy? Her survival hinged on the answer. "He killed my family," she managed, her knife hand trembling slightly. "Him and the others. They attacked our wagon train." Something flashed in the warrior's eyes, a controlled anger that seemed directed not at her, but at the men in her drawings. "These men also killed my brother's family," he said, his deep voice carrying surprising gentleness. "Wore blue soldier uniforms, but spoke to each other as white men do. I hunt them now." He touched the drawing of Rayburn with one finger. "Your pictures show their faces better than my memory. This is strong medicine." Abigail's mind struggled to process this information. The warrior before her wasn't allied with the raiders, but was hunting them for reasons that mirrored her own loss. The parallelism seemed impossible, yet his recognition of Rayburn was unmistakable. "Who are you?" she finally asked, the knife in her hand lowering slightly. "I am called Swift Fox," he answered, "scout for Lakota, hunter of the men who spill blood and blame others for the deed." He paused, studying her with newfound respect. "You have survived alone through winter moons. This takes a strong spirit." From outside came the distant crack of a branch breaking underweight, a sound distinct from the natural settling of snow-laden trees. Swift Fox's posture changed instantly, body tensing as he moved toward the entrance with fluid silence. "Others search these mountains," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Men who wear one face to the blue coats and another when they hunt. The same men from your drawings." A cold that had nothing to do with the winter air seeped into Abigail's bones. The raiders had returned to the territory. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice small. "Tracked them for 3 days," Swift Fox replied. "They sweep the mountains in groups, looking for something." His gaze fixed on Abigail with new intensity. Or someone. The realization struck Abigail with terrible clarity. The raiders weren't simply passing through the territory again. They were hunting her. Perhaps they had counted bodies at the massacre, sight and found one missing. Perhaps they had discovered signs of her escape. Whatever the reason, they were methodically searching the mountains, and her temporary safety would soon evaporate like morning mist in summer sun. Swift Fox seemed to read the shifting calculations on her face. "Young one with strong spirit faces choice," he said. "Stay alone against many hunters, or trust Swift Fox, who follows the same trail of vengeance." Abigail's world narrowed to this impossible decision. Trust this stranger from a people she had been taught to fear, or face both the killers and the merciless winter alone. The knife in her hand suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate against either threat. "How do I know you're not with them?" she demanded, a final, desperate question. Swift Fox's expression shifted subtly, revealing a depth of pain that resonated with her own. "Men who killed your family killed mine also," he said simply. "Used blue soldier uniforms when they attacked. Our hunting camp wore settlers' clothes when they attacked your wagons. Create war between peoples who might otherwise live in peace." He slowly extended his open hand, palm upward, a universal gesture of offering. "I hunt for justice, not for harm to children. Come or stay. Your choice, but choose now." Another branch snapped in the forest below, closer this time. The decision crystallized in Abigail's mind with sudden clarity. After months of isolation, months of trusting nothing but her own instincts, she recognized the truth in Swift Fox's words, in his eyes that carried the same haunted shadows she saw in her own reflection. She took a single step forward, then paused. "If you betray me," she said with quiet intensity, "I'll kill you in your sleep." For the first time, a genuine smile crossed Swift Fox's weathered face. "Strong spirit," he commented with approval. "Good, you will need it for what lies ahead." As the shadows lengthened across the snow and the distant sounds of the searching party grew closer, Abigail Richardson took her first tentative steps toward the Lakota scout. With each step, she left behind a piece of the solitary creature. She had become and moved toward an uncertain alliance that would challenge everything she had been taught to believe about the frontier, about native peoples, and about her own capacity for courage. Neither could know as they gathered the few belongings Abigail would take, including several pieces of charcoal carefully wrapped in leather, that their unlikely partnership would eventually unravel a conspiracy that stretched from the highest levels of territorial government to the blood-stained hands of men who profited from hatred between peoples. Or that the witness and the warrior, bound by shared tragedy, would become the unlikely architects of a justice both had abandoned hope of ever finding. The journey to Swift Fox's camp tested Abigail's endurance beyond anything she had faced during her months of solitary survival. They traveled in tense silence, moving with deliberate care through the forest to avoid leaving obvious signs of their passage. The Lakota scout set a demanding pace, occasionally pausing to listen or to obscure their tracks, but never slowing for Abigail's benefit. Pride kept her from complaining. After surviving alone for so long, she refused to appear weak before this stranger who had disrupted her isolation. Despite her determination, The strain showed in her labored breathing and increasingly unsteady steps as the afternoon stretched on. After 2 hours of relentless movement downslope, Swift Fox finally halted at the edge of a narrow ravine. He studied Abigail's exhausted form with an appraising gaze. "Rest," he said simply, gesturing to a moss-covered log. Abigail sank onto it gratefully, though she maintained her vigilance, keeping the hunting knife visible in her lap. Swift Fox ignored the implied threat, kneeling instead to examine her makeshift footwear with unexpected concern. "White child's boots are not made for mountains," he observed, noting how the rabbit fur wrappings had worn through in several places, exposing blisters and raw skin beneath. "Need proper moccasins." From his pack, he produced strips of softened deer hide and a small pot of strong-smelling salve. Without asking permission, he began applying the medicine to her feet. Abigail tensed at the contact, but allowed it, recognizing the practical necessity. "Bear fat and pine pitch," Swift Fox explained as he worked. "Helps healing, keeps infection away." His unexpected gentleness confused Abigail. The newspaper stories in Philadelphia had portrayed Indians as savages lacking civilized sensibilities, yet here was this warrior treating her wounds with the careful attention her mother might have shown. "Why did you come alone?" she asked, breaking their mutual silence. "Wouldn't your people help hunt these raiders?" Swift Fox's hands paused momentarily. "Some things must be proven before spoken," he replied. "My chief is wise but cautious. White men who speak against other white men are often not believed. Indian who accuses whites of wearing soldier clothes to blame Lakota, even less likely to be believed," Abigail finished. "Need evidence, need a witness." His dark eyes met hers with surprising intensity. "Need truth that even the fort commander cannot ignore." The implication was clear. Abigail was not simply a child he had found in the wilderness, but potentially a valuable ally in his quest for justice. The realization should have frightened her, yet it carried a strange comfort. For months, her survival had seemed pointless, disconnected from any larger purpose. Now her continued existence might serve as testament to a truth others sought to bury. As Swift Fox finished wrapping her feet in the deer-hide strips, a question formed in Abigail's mind, one that had haunted her since their first encounter. "How long were you watching me before you showed yourself?" A hint of respect flickered across his stoic features. "8 days. Found your cave during the last big snow, tracked your movements, studied your patterns." He secured the wrapping with a practiced knot. "You survive well for a child, better than many grown men." Abigail wasn't sure whether to feel violated or flattered by his surveillance. "You could have approached earlier. Trust must be earned," he replied simply. "Needed to know if you run. To raiders or from them." He rose to his feet, gathering his pack. "Rest done, we move now." They continued downward through increasingly dense forest, the mountain air warming slightly as they descended into a sheltered valley. Abigail noticed how Swift Fox moved, not with the crashing directness of white hunters she had observed, but with a fluid efficiency that seemed almost part of the forest itself. He taught without words, his movements demonstrating the proper way to place feet, to use terrain for concealment, and to listen to the forest's warnings. Despite her exhaustion and lingering suspicion, Abigail found herself absorbing these lessons, admiring the skill with which he navigated the wilderness. When he suddenly raised his hand in a signal to stop, she froze instantly, her senses alert for danger. Swift Fox pointed to a nearby thicket where a young deer browsed, unaware of their presence. In a single fluid motion, he knocked an arrow to his bow and drew it back. The arrow flew true, taking the deer through the heart. It collapsed without a sound, its death as efficient and merciful as possible. "Food," Swift Fox stated, moving toward the fallen animal, "and warmer clothing. For you." He approached the deer with reverence, kneeling beside it to whisper words in his native tongue before beginning the butchering process. Abigail watched, transfixed by the ritual that transformed the act of killing from mere necessity into something approaching ceremony. "What did you say to it?" she asked. "Thanked its spirit for giving life so we might live," he replied, his knife moving with practiced precision. "Asked forgiveness for taking what was not freely offered." He glanced up at her. "Your people do not thank the animals they kill." The question carried no judgment, merely curiosity, yet Abigail felt a strange discomfort. "My father always said a prayer before we ate," she offered, "thanking God for providing." Swift Fox nodded. "Different words, same meaning." He worked in silence for several minutes before adding, "All people must eat. All people must kill to live. How we honor what dies for us shows what kind of people we are." The simple philosophy resonated with Abigail in ways she hadn't expected. For months, she had killed rabbits and squirrels to survive, feeling nothing beyond grim necessity. The idea that those deaths deserved acknowledgement, even reverence, offered a strange comfort. By the time Swift Fox had dressed the deer, salvaging every usable part, the afternoon light had begun to fade. He packed the meat efficiently, then gestured for Abigail to continue following. "Camp close now," he assured her, "before dark." Their destination proved to be a natural hollow in the mountainside, invisible until they were almost upon it. A narrow opening between rock faces led to a sheltered basin barely 30 feet across. A small lean-to of branches and hides stood against the far wall, with a fire pit positioned where smoke would disperse through a natural chimney in the rock. "Winter camp," Swift Fox explained, hidden from unfriendly eyes. The hollow offered perfect concealment while providing protection from the elements, similar to Abigail's cave, but clearly chosen with a warrior's eye for defensibility. A single sentry positioned at the narrow entrance could guard against any approach. Swift Fox busied himself preparing a fire while Abigail took stock of her surroundings. The camp showed signs of extended habitation, a stack of dried firewood, a crude drying rack for meat, even animal hides stretched for tanning. Yet it held no personal items, no decorative touches that might reveal something of its occupant's character. "You live alone?" she asked, as he coaxed flames from tinder. "For now," he replied. "My people camp on a 2 days journey west. We'll return when justice is found." He glanced at her. "Or when snow melts from high passes, whichever comes first." As the fire grew stronger, spreading welcome warmth throughout the hollow, Swift Fox skewered strips of venison on green sticks and positioned them over the flames. The rich aroma of cooking meat filled the air, causing Abigail's stomach to clench. Painfully, she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten anything so substantial. They ate in silence, Abigail forcing herself to take small, measured bites despite her hunger. Swift Fox watched her with quiet approval, recognizing the discipline of someone who had learned to ration scarce resources. When they had finished eating, he produced a water skin and a handful of dried berries, a simple dessert that tasted like extravagance to Abigail's deprived palate. Only then, with hunger satisfied and the fire casting dancing shadows against the rock walls, did Swift Fox finally ask the question she had been dreading? "Now, young one," he said, his deep voice gentle but firm, "tell me what you saw when bad men came." The request broke something inside her. For months, Abigail had carried the memory of the massacre locked away, unspoken, a weight she bore alone in the silence of her cave. Now faced with a direct invitation to release that burden, words poured from her in a torrent of grief and horror. She described everything: the early morning attack, the methodical slaughter, her concealment in the tall grass, the clear view she had of the raiders removing what appeared to be military uniforms afterward. She remembered specific phrases they had used, including names: Rayburn, Miller, and their leader, a man called Montgomery, with a distinctive silver-handled pistol. Swift. Fox listened without interruption, his face revealing little beyond intense concentration. When Abigail finally fell silent, emotionally drained by the recounting, he nodded once. Same men, he confirmed grimly. Same methods, same leader. He rose and moved to a small pack secured beneath a rock overhang. From it, he withdrew a folded piece of paper, a wanted poster, weathered and creased from repeated handling. He passed it to Abigail. James Montgomery, Swift Fox said, as she examined the crude illustration that did indeed show a hard-faced man with cold eyes. Former Army scout, now leads men who attack both white settlements and Indian hunting parties, takes gold, furs, horses, leaves bodies and blame. The poster offered a substantial reward for Montgomery's capture, dead or alive, but had been issued nearly 2 years earlier. The territorial authorities clearly hadn't succeeded in apprehending him. "He killed your family?" Abigail asked. Swift Fox's expression darkened. "My sister's family. 4 moons ago. Hunting camp near Medicine Lake." His hands tightened into fists. Men dressed as bluecoat soldiers shot children first so they would not escape. Took horses, weapons, winter furs. His control slipped momentarily, revealing the raw grief beneath. "Found my sister last, still alive. Told me the truth before joining my ancestors. Said attackers spoke to each other as white men do, not as soldiers. One called another by name, Montgomery." Abigail absorbed this information, connecting it with her own experience. "They want whites and natives to blame each other," she said slowly, voicing the realization, "while they profit from both." "Smart girl," Swift Fox acknowledged. "Easier to steal, to kill, when people look in the wrong direction." He stared into the fire, his voice dropping lower. "Fort Commander sends soldiers to punish Lakota for attacks we did not make. White settlers fear and hate us for violence done by men like Montgomery wearing false feathers." The political implications were beyond Abigail's full comprehension, but she understood enough. The murders she had witnessed were part of something larger, a deliberate strategy to incite conflict between settlers and native tribes. "Will anyone believe us?" she asked quietly. "A Lakota warrior and a child." Swift Fox's gaze returned to her, assessing. "Truth has power," he said simply, "but needs evidence, needs witness who can speak to both worlds." He studied her with new intensity. "You walk between worlds now, Abigail Richardson, not fully of white settlements anymore, not of Lakota people. Something new." The use of her full name startled her. She hadn't introduced herself. Reading her surprise, Swift Fox explained, "Found a small book in your cave. Had names written inside, Thomas, Sarah, Samuel, and Abigail Richardson." His expression softened slightly. "Books are safe. Will return to you when the time is right." The knowledge that her father's pocket Bible, the family record with all their births carefully inscribed in his neat handwriting, had been preserved, sent unexpected warmth through Abigail's chest. Something tangible remained of her former life, even as that life receded further into memory with each passing day. "Montgomery's men are still hunting," she said, returning to more immediate concerns. "They were getting closer to my cave." Swift Fox nodded. "They search methodically, ridge by ridge, valley by valley." He added more wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Storm will slow them for 2 days, maybe 3. After that, must be ready." "Ready for what?" "To hunt the hunters," he said simply. "To gather evidence that cannot be denied. To find justice for both our families." Abigail stared at him in disbelief. "I'm just a child. What can I do against armed men?" Not all strength is in the arm that holds a weapon, Swift Fox replied. Sometimes the strongest power is in the eyes that saw, the memory that holds, the voice that speaks truth when others listen. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. You survived alone in the mountains for 2 moons, found food, shelter, warmth when grown men would have died. Such strength is rare even among my people. His assessment, delivered without flattery or condescension, penetrated the defensive walls Abigail had built around herself. For months, she had defined herself solely by what she had lost. Now, this warrior from a people she had been taught to, fear, was defining her by what she had achieved, by the strength she had demonstrated, rather than the weakness she felt. "I'm afraid," she admitted, the confession barely audible above the crackling fire. "Good," Swift Fox replied, surprising her. "Fear keeps warriors alive when courage alone would lead to death." He removed a small leather pouch from around his neck and held it out to her. "My grandfather gave this to me when I first rode to war, said it would protect me if my heart remained true." The pouch was simple, made of soft buckskin with intricate beadwork depicting a fox in mid-leap, yet the offering clearly carried profound significance. "I can't take this," she protested. "Not giving," Swift Fox clarified. "Lending until our hunt is done." He placed the cord around her neck, the pouch settling against her chest. "Medicine bag holds power of ancestors, makes clear path when many trails cross." Abigail touched the pouch hesitantly, uncertain whether to believe in such things, yet unwilling to dismiss the sincerity behind the gesture. "Thank you," she said. Simply, Swift Fox nodded once, satisfied, then rose to check the security of their shelter before settling back beside the fire. "Sleep now," he instructed. "Tomorrow begin teaching you Lakota ways of moving, of seeing, of hunting. Not to make you Lakota, too late for that." A glimmer of amusement touched his eyes. "But to help you survive what comes." As Abigail curled beside the fire, wrapped in a rabbit fur blanket Swift Fox had provided, she realized something had shifted during their conversation. The man she had feared just hours earlier had become, if not yet a friend, then at least an ally with whom she shared a common purpose. The isolation that had defined her existence for months had been broken, replaced by a tentative partnership born of shared loss and mutual need. She fingered the medicine pouch as sleep approached, wondering what her father would think of her unlikely alliance with a Lakota warrior. Samuel Richardson had always been more open-minded than most settlers, cautioning his children against believing every frontier tale about savage Indians. He had taught them to judge individuals by their actions, not by the fears and prejudices of others. By that measure, Swift Fox had proven himself worthy of at least provisional trust. Whether that trust would be enough to sustain them through the dangerous days ahead remained to be seen. As consciousness faded, Abigail's last thought was a startling realization. For the first time since the massacre, she had spent hours without, constantly looking over her shoulder without jumping at every sound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the fragile alliance forming between them. But tonight, in the shelter of Swift Fox's hidden camp, Abigail Richardson slept more soundly than she had in months, the medicine pouch warm against her skin like a promise of protection in a world that had offered precious little of it. Dawn arrived with clear skies, the snowstorm having spent its fury during the night. Abigail woke to find Swift Fox already busy preparing a simple breakfast of dried meat and pine needle tea. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the narrow entrance of their hidden camp, casting long shadows across the rocky floor. "Today, we prepare," Swift Fox announced, as he handed Abigail a wooden cup of steaming tea. "Learn the truth behind Montgomery's attacks." Abigail sipped the fragrant liquid, its bitter taste now familiar and oddly comforting. "How do we do that without getting caught?" Swift Fox's expression revealed satisfaction at her practical question, not panicking, not refusing, but immediately, focusing on methods. During the next hour, he outlined a strategy built on stealth and intelligence gathering rather than direct confrontation. Montgomery's men maintained a semi-permanent camp in an abandoned mining settlement 3 valleys, west of their current position. According to Swift Fox's observations over the past month, the raiders came and went regularly, sometimes in small groups, sometimes nearly all together. 7 days ago, most riders leave camp, Swift Fox explained. Only 3 remain, perhaps. More return now, after searching mountains for you. He spread a crude map drawn on a piece of leather, indicating their position and the location of Montgomery's base. The settlement sat in a valley that provided good grazing for horses and multiple escape routes, a location chosen with tactical awareness. It consisted of 6 structures: the main cabin where Montgomery stayed, a bunkhouse for his men, stables, and 3 storage buildings. We watch first, Swift Fox decided. Count men, learn patterns, find weaknesses. Abigail studied the map with growing apprehension. How close do we need to get? Ridge above settlement. Good view, safe distance. He pointed to an elevated position overlooking the valley. Can watch without being seen. The morning was spent in careful preparation. Swift Fox fashioned proper moccasins for Abigail from the deer hide he had prepared, showing her how to lace them securely around her ankles. The footwear felt strange after months in her increasingly worn boots, but she could immediately appreciate the improved flexibility and grip on uneven terrain. Next came camouflage. Using clay, charcoal, and plant pigments, Swift Fox created a mixture that he applied to Abigail's face and hands, disguising her pale skin that would otherwise stand out against the winter landscape. He demonstrated how to move in short bursts, freezing in place between movements, making detection far more difficult, even when in the open. Most importantly, he taught her a series of hand signals that would allow them to communicate silently. While observing Montgomery's camp, each gesture was precise and unambiguous. Danger ahead, remain still, retreat, numbers of men spotted. Abigail practiced until she could reproduce each sign perfectly and recognize them instantly when Swift Fox made them. By midday, they were ready to depart. Abigail had bundled her few possessions, including her precious charcoal sticks, into a small pack that Swift Fox had fashioned from rabbit skins. Her father's hunting knife hung at her waist, and Swift Fox's medicine pouch remained securely around her neck. We travel until sunset, Swift Fox explained as they prepared to leave the safety of the hidden camp. Make night camp. Reach the ridge by noon tomorrow. The journey proved just as demanding as Abigail had anticipated. Swift Fox set a challenging pace as they navigated through snow-covered valleys and forests, always choosing routes that offered concealment. Unlike their previous journey, however, he now took time to explain his decisions, why certain paths were safer, how to recognize signs of recent human passage, when to seek high ground for better visibility. Abigail absorbed these lessons eagerly, recognizing their value not just for their current mission, but for her own survival. Swift Fox was an attentive teacher, occasionally testing her with questions or asking her to lead temporarily, correcting her mistakes without criticism. As twilight approached, they reached a densely wooded area that Swift Fox deemed suitable for a night camp. No fire, minimal comfort, but excellent concealment. They ate cold provisions from his pack, speaking little, both aware of the increasing danger as they approached Montgomery's territory. While preparing their sparse bedding of pine boughs beneath a fallen log, Abigail found herself studying Swift Fox with growing curiosity. Despite their days together, she knew remarkably little about the man who had become her unexpected ally. Even as he had extracted her life story, he had revealed almost nothing of his own. "How did you become a scout?" she asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Swift Fox glanced up, surprised by the personal question. For a moment, Abigail thought he might ignore it. Then his expression softened slightly. "Born to it," he replied. "My father was a scout for the Hunk Papa Band, taught me to read sign, to move unseen, to understand white man's ways." His voice carried a complex mixture of pride and something darker. "Valuable skill when whites pushed into our hunting grounds." "How did you learn English so well?" A shadow crossed his features. "Spent 3 winters at mission school. White men thought they could change Lakota into something else." His hands continued their methodical preparation of the camp, but his eyes had grown distant. "Learned their words, their numbers, their God. Also learned not all white men think the same." This glimpse into Swift Fox's past explained much about his unusual comfort moving between cultures, his ability to understand both native and settler perspectives. Like Abigail herself, he existed in a liminal space, not fully belonging to either world, yet able to navigate both. "Sleep now," Swift Fox instructed, ending the brief moment of personal revelation. "Tomorrow requires clear eyes." Despite her nervous anticipation of what awaited them, exhaustion quickly overcame Abigail. Her last conscious thought was gratitude, that she no longer faced this dangerous world entirely alone. Morning brought light snow and biting cold. They broke camp before dawn, moving through the dim forest with increased caution as they approached Montgomery's territory. By mid-morning, Swift Fox had located the ridge that would serve as their observation post, a rocky outcropping partially screened by stunted pines, offering a commanding view of the valley below while remaining virtually invisible from beneath. Settling into position, they finally beheld their objective. The abandoned mining settlement sprawled across the valley floor, its weathered buildings forming a rough half-circle around what had once been the main shaft. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, the main cabin and the bunkhouse, indicating occupation. In a corral beside the stable, Abigail counted 12 horses, their breath steaming in the cold air. "More men than expected," Swift Fox whispered, his expression hardening. "Raiders must have returned from the search." Using subtle hand gestures, he directed Abigail's attention to specific points of interest: the sentry positioned outside the main cabin, the regular patrols around the perimeter, the location of what appeared to be storehouses. One building, in particular, drew Swift Fox's focus, a small structure set apart from the others, with a crude lock visible on its door. "Valuable things kept there," he murmured. "Goods taken from raids." They settled in for extended observation, taking turns, watching through a small brass spyglass that Swift Fox produced from his pack. As the day progressed, a clearer picture of the camp's routine emerged. Men came and went from the bunkhouse. A hunting party departed mid-morning, returning hours later with a deer carcass. A pair of raiders practiced shooting at bottles behind the stable. Most significantly, they witnessed the arrival of a solitary rider in the early afternoon, a tall man on a distinctive black horse, wearing an army officer's coat despite having no apparent military affiliation. The deference with which he was greeted marked him clearly as someone of importance. "Captain Lewis," Swift Fox said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Fort Kearny meets with Montgomery often." "An army officer is working with them?" Abigail asked, horrified by the implication. Swift Fox nodded grimly. "Some bluecoats take money to look the other way. Some do more." He adjusted the spyglass. "Captain Lewis writes reports blaming Lakota for raids. Gets promotions when he finds stolen items in our camps, items Montgomery's men plant after killing our people." The revelation struck Abigail with physical force. The conspiracy was larger and more organized than she had imagined. Not merely Bandits creating convenient misunderstandings, but a calculated alliance between corrupt military officers and mercenary killers, deliberately manufacturing conflict to serve their purposes. As twilight approached, they witnessed a scene that confirmed their worst suspicions. Montgomery himself emerged from the main cabin, a broad-shouldered man with a trimmed beard and the silver-handled pistol Abigail remembered. He, Captain Lewis, and two other men gathered around a table placed outside, spreading out what appeared to be maps. Even from their elevated position, the animated discussion was occasionally audible when the wind shifted favorably. Fragments of conversation drifted upward. Jenkins' settlement, scheduled patrol, blamed on the Sioux. Their planning was explicit and chillingly methodical. "They're organizing another raid," Abigail whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the medicine pouch at her neck. Swift Fox's expression remained impassive, but his eyes blazed with controlled rage. "Need better evidence," he said after a moment. "Need something that proves Montgomery attacks both whites and Lakota. Something no one can ignore." They continued their observation as darkness fell, watching as the camp transformed in the gathering gloom. Lanterns were lit, casting yellow pools of light between the buildings. The planning session broke up, with Captain Lewis mounting his horse for departure. As he rode away, Montgomery and his men retreated to the main cabin, where the glow of a substantial fire soon brightened the windows. "We wait," Swift Fox decided. "Men drink after making plans. Guard becomes less careful. Then we move closer." The next few hours stretched interminably as they huddled in their concealed position, the mountain night growing increasingly bitter around them. Abigail fought to control her shivering, knowing that motion might betray their presence to watchful eyes below. Swift Fox remained utterly still beside her, his focus unwavering as he monitored the gradual changes in the camp. Around midnight, the settlement had grown quiet. Only a single guard remained visible, pacing slowly between the main cabin and the bunkhouse, occasionally warming himself by a small exterior fire. Inside both buildings, lights had dimmed, suggesting most of the men had retired for the night. "Now," Swift Fox whispered, gathering their meager supplies. "We go down, look in storage building, find evidence, then leave before dawn." They descended the ridge with agonizing slowness, using every shadow and contour for concealment. Swift Fox moved like a ghost across the snow-covered ground, sometimes seeming to leave no tracks at all. Abigail followed as best she could, mimicking his movements, placing her moccasins precisely where he had stepped. When they reached the valley floor, they paused in a stand of pines at the edge of the clearing, studying the guard's pattern one final time. He maintained a predictable route, disappearing behind the bunkhouse for nearly 2 minutes during each circuit, a vulnerability Swift Fox had noted hours earlier. Using hand signals, Swift Fox indicated their approach route, a path that would keep the bunkhouse between them and the guard during his momentary absence from view. Abigail nodded her understanding, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be audible in the still night air. They waited for the guard to begin his circuit, then moved the instant he vanished behind the bunkhouse. 20 seconds of exposed crossing, then the blessed shadow of the storage building. Swift Fox immediately set to work on the crude lock, using a slender metal tool he had produced from his pack. Within moments, the lock surrendered with a soft click. The interior was black as pitch. Swift Fox eased the door open just enough for them to slip inside, then closed it softly behind them. From his pack, he produced a small, covered firepot, containing a single glowing coal. With practiced efficiency, he kindled a tiny flame in a small stone cup, providing just enough illumination to reveal their surroundings without being visible from outside. The contents of the storage building exceeded Abigail's darkest expectations. Plundered goods filled the space. Weapons, furs, jewelry, even military supplies that must have been stolen from army shipments. But most disturbing were the personal effects. Family Bibles with names inscribed inside, children's toys, wedding bands, hand-carved pipes clearly of Lakota design, medicine pouches similar to the one Swift Fox had lent her, organized trophies from multiple massacres categorized with mercenary precision. "Look for connection," Swift Fox whispered, moving methodically through the grim collection. "Something that shows the same men attacked your wagon train and my sister's camp." Abigail searched with growing horror, each item representing another. Life destroyed by Montgomery's raiders, a child's doll with a lovingly embroidered face, a silver pocket watch with a family portrait inside, a carved wooden flute adorned with painted symbols. As she reached a stack of leather saddlebags in the corner, she noticed something protruding from one, the edge of what appeared to be a ledger book. Carefully extracting it, she opened its pages in the dim light. "Swift Fox," she whispered urgently. "Look at this." The book contained detailed records of Montgomery's operations, dates, locations, participants, items taken, and most significantly, the careful accounting of profits. Shared with collaborators, Captain Lewis's name appeared repeatedly, along with several other military officers and territorial officials. Most damning of all, the entries explicitly noted whether each attack was conducted as soldiers or as Indians, with corresponding details about the disguises and planted evidence used in each case. The final pages included plans for upcoming raids, including one on the Jenkins settlement scheduled for the following week, the same location they had overheard being discussed earlier. "This proves everything," Abigail breathed, stunned by the scope of the conspiracy revealed. Not just the attacks, but who ordered them and who profited. Swift Fox's expression transformed as he scanned the damning evidence. "More important than what we hope to find," he agreed. "Shows all corrupt men, not just raiders." He carefully secured the ledger inside his shirt, then continued searching the building with renewed purpose. From a wooden chest, he retrieved a distinctive army officer's coat with captain's insignia, clearly used for impersonating military personnel during raids. Nearby, he found a bundle containing feathered headdresses, face paint, and other items, used to masquerade as Lakota warriors. "Physical evidence," he said, gathering these items as well, "to support the ledger." Their search had been so absorbing that neither noticed the approaching footsteps until the door latch rattled. They froze, extinguishing their tiny light source instantly. "Thought I saw something moving over here," a gruff voice called. "Montgomery wants an extra check on the goods." The door swung open, spilling moonlight into the darkened interior. A bearded raider stood silhouetted in the entrance, momentarily blind as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. That instant of vulnerability was all Swift Fox needed. He moved with lightning speed, clamping one hand over the man's mouth while the other delivered a precise blow to the side of his head. The raider collapsed without a sound. Swift Fox dragged the unconscious man inside, closing the door behind him. Working quickly, he bound and gagged the raider with strips of leather from his pack. "Must leave now," he whispered urgently. "Others will look for him soon." They slipped out of the storage building, the precious ledger and disguises secured in Swift Fox's pack. Rather than risk crossing the open ground again, they skirted the perimeter of the settlement, using buildings for cover, moving from shadow to shadow with desperate stealth. They had nearly reached the tree line when a shout rang out from the direction of the bunkhouse. The alarm had been raised, whether due to the missing guard or some other factor they couldn't know. What mattered was the immediate response. Lanterns flaring to life, men emerging with weapons drawn, orders being shouted across the compound. "Run," Swift Fox commanded, abandoning stealth for speed. "To the ridge, now!" They raced for the tree line as the first shots rang out behind them, bullets thudding into the snow or splintering bark from nearby trees. The element of surprise had been lost, but darkness and the forest still offered some protection as they plunged into the trees, beginning the arduous climb back to higher ground. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, men shouting, horses being saddled. Montgomery was mobilizing his entire force to hunt down whoever had infiltrated his camp and discovered his secrets. As they scrambled up the steep slope, Abigail clutched the medicine pouch at her neck, drawing strength from its presence. The ledger they had found represented more than evidence. It was the key to justice for both their families and for countless other victims of Montgomery's brutal strategy. Now, they just had to survive long enough to deliver it to someone who would act on its revelations. The night that had begun with careful observation had transformed into a desperate flight for survival, with Montgomery's entire band of killers on their trail. Yet amid the terror of pursuit, Abigail felt something unexpected, a fierce determination that transcended fear. For the first time since the massacre, she wasn't simply running from death, but running toward justice. They fled through the frozen forest, the sounds of pursuit growing behind them. Swift Fox led them on a punishing uphill climb, bypassing their original observation post in favor of higher, more treacherous terrain. Abigail's legs burned with exertion, her lungs struggling to draw enough of the thin mountain air, but fear propelled her forward with each desperate stride. "They bring horses," Swift Fox said grimly as they paused briefly in the shelter of a massive pine. "Cannot outrun on flat ground." The distant whinnying of horses confirmed his assessment. Montgomery's men were mounting a coordinated hunt, spreading outward from the settlement in an organized search pattern. Their knowledge of the territory and superior numbers created an overwhelming advantage. "Where can we go?" Abigail gasped, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Swift Fox scanned the rugged landscape, his expression calculating. "Must separate," he decided, his voice carrying reluctant certainty. "Split their pursuit, create confusion." The strategy made tactical sense, but Abigail felt a surge of dread at the thought of facing this wilderness alone again. Swift Fox seemed to read her thoughts. "Not asking you to go alone," he clarified. "Need you to carry evidence." He removed the ledger from his pack and wrapped it carefully in waterproof oilskin. Most important thing now, must reach Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie. The name sparked immediate recognition. Unlike the smaller, more corrupt Fort Kearny, where Captain Lewis held authority, Fort Laramie was a major military installation, home to the headquarters of the regional command and, most importantly, to officials who might act on evidence of conspiracy. "Why would they believe me?" Abigail asked, acutely aware of her status as a child, and worse, one whose appearance and behavior had grown increasingly wild during her months in the wilderness. "Major William Harper commands at Laramie," Swift Fox explained, securing the wrapped ledger inside Abigail's small pack. "Honest man, treats with Lakota fairly, will listen to evidence, not just words." Shouts echoed from below, closer now. Their brief respite had ended. Swift Fox's face grew solemn as he quickly outlined their desperate strategy. He would create a false trail heading northwest toward Lakota territory, the direction Montgomery would expect him to flee. The pursuit would naturally focus on capturing a Lakota warrior rather than a white child. Meanwhile, Abigail would travel northeast, following a series of landmarks toward Fort Laramie. 3 days' journey, Swift Fox estimated, sketching a crude map in the snow with a stick. Follow the sunrise each morning. Cross Black Thunder River. Keep Great Stone Ridge on left until you see the Soldier Road. It was a dangerous gamble, sending her alone through winter wilderness with Montgomery's killers hunting between her and safety. Yet the alternative, remaining together as an easier target, offered even less chance of success. "How will you find me again?" Abigail asked, struggling to maintain composure as her world tilted once more toward isolation. Swift Fox removed a small object from around his neck, a carved bone whistle on a leather cord. 3 short calls when you reach soldiers," he instructed, demonstrating the distinct pattern of sounds. We'll find you after leading raiders away." From his pack, he produced several items vital to her journey. A small bag of pemmican, flint, and steel for fire-making, and most preciously, 2 of the charcoal drawings she had created in her cave. He had carefully preserved these portraits of Montgomery and Rayburn, recognizing their value as evidence. "Your drawings show their faces better than words describe," he said, helping her secure these treasures in her pack. "Soldiers will recognize Montgomery, former scout. His face is known at fort." The voices below grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of horses moving through snow-laden underbrush. Their time had run out. Swift Fox placed his hands on Abigail's shoulders, his normally stoic expression giving way to fierce intensity. "Strong spirit," he reminded her, "survived alone before, will survive again." Without further ceremony, he turned and began moving rapidly downhill and westward, deliberately leaving clear tracks in the snow and breaking branches in a way he had previously been careful to avoid, creating an obvious trail for the pursuers to follow. Abigail remained frozen for a moment, watching as he vanished among the trees. Then survival instinct reasserted itself. She turned eastward and began moving carefully upslope, using every technique Swift Fox had taught her to minimize her tracks. The weight of responsibility settled heavily upon her small shoulders. Not just her own survival now, but justice for her family, for Swift Fox's sister, and for countless other victims of Montgomery's bloody conspiracy. The night seemed endless as Abigail navigated the treacherous mountain terrain. The quarter moon provided just enough light to avoid deadly drops and impassable obstacles, but little comfort against the growing cold. Twice she heard distant gunshots echoing across the valleys, each report sending a spike of fear through her heart. Had Swift Fox been discovered? Was he wounded or captured? Or had he managed to lead the pursuers into an ambush of his own making? Questions without answers, fears without resolution. She pushed forward, focusing on each step, each decision, forcing all else from her mind. Dawn found her miles from Montgomery's settlement, high on an eastern slope with a commanding view of the territory she had traversed. From this vantage, she could see thin columns of smoke rising from multiple locations in the valleys below, the campfires of search parties who had maintained their hunt throughout the night. None appeared to be moving in her direction, suggesting Swift Fox's diversion had been successful, at least temporarily. Abigail allowed herself a brief rest, consuming a small portion of pemmican and gathering snow to melt in her mouth for hydration. Her body ached from the sustained exertion, unused to such demanding travel after months in the relative security of her cave. Yet there was also a strange exhilaration beneath the exhaustion, a sense of purpose that transformed mere survival into something more meaningful. The morning passed in careful progress across the mountain ridge, maintaining elevation to avoid the search parties below. By midday, Abigail had reached the first landmark Swift Fox had identified, a distinctive formation of 3 pinnacle rocks thrusting upward like accusing fingers. Here she was, to descend into the neighboring valley, where she would find the Black Thunder River that would guide her toward Fort Laramie. The descent proved treacherous, the eastern slope steeper and more exposed than the western approaches. Twice Abigail lost her footing on icy rocks, saving herself from serious injury only by grabbing at stunted pines that clung tenaciously to the mountainside. By the time she reached the valley floor, her hands were scratched and bleeding, her moccasins sodden from deep snow. The Black Thunder River lay partially frozen before her, its center still flowing between borders of ice. Following its course northeastward, Abigail maintained a prudent distance from the banks, using the tree line for cover while keeping the water in sight as her guide. The valley offered easier travel than the mountain ridges, but also less visibility and potentially more exposure to searchers. As afternoon faded toward evening, a new sound reached her, the rhythmic pounding of hooves on packed snow, approaching rapidly from behind. Abigail darted into denser forest, pressing herself against the broad trunk of an ancient pine. 3 riders passed along the river's edge, moving at a canter, their attention focused on the terrain ahead rather than the forest beside them. She caught only glimpses through the branches, weathered men in heavy coats, rifles resting across their saddles, determination evident even at a distance. Not Montgomery's raiders, judging by their appearance and direct route, but likely trappers or traders using the river valley as a natural pathway through the mountains. In normal circumstances, such travelers might have represented potential allies, but Abigail had learned harsh lessons about trust. Until she reached Fort Laramie, everyone she encountered represented possible danger. The first day of separation passed into a night of fitful rest beneath the inadequate shelter of a fallen log. The second day brought new challenges, a storm front moving in from the west, bringing driving snow and biting winds that reduced visibility and threatened hypothermia if she couldn't find adequate shelter. By mid-afternoon, the storm had intensified to near blizzard conditions, forcing Abigail to abandon her planned route in favor of immediate survival. Fortune guided her to a small cave formed by an overhanging cliff face. The space was barely large, enough to accommodate her small frame, but it provided critical protection from the howling wind and accumulating snow. Here she made the difficult decision to risk a tiny fire, gathering the driest twigs and needles she could find and using the flint and steel Swift Fox had provided. The resulting flame was hardly larger than a candle, but its meager warmth made the difference between survival and freezing. Huddled beside this precious heat source, Abigail removed the oilskin-wrapped ledger from her pack, confirming it remained dry and intact. The physical evidence of Montgomery's crimes had gained almost talismanic significance, a concrete link to justice that made her desperate journey worthwhile. As the storm raged outside her small sanctuary, Abigail found herself unconsciously reaching for one of her remaining charcoal sticks. Without the luxury of paper, she began sketching on a relatively smooth section of the cave wall, not another portrait of the raiders, but Swift Fox's face, captured with the same careful attention to detail. The high cheekbones, the watchful eyes, the subtle lines etching his weathered skin. A tribute to the ally who had risked everything to help her, whose fate remained unknown. The storm maintained its fury throughout the night and into the following morning, delaying Abigail's departure until nearly midday. When she finally emerged from the small cave, she found a transformed landscape. Nearly 2 feet of fresh snow blanketed the valley, obliterating any trace of her previous passage, but also making new travel arduous. The Black Thunder River had frozen completely in the extreme cold, its surface now a treacherous pathway of ice barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. By late afternoon of the 3rd day, with her supplies nearly exhausted and her strength fading, Abigail spotted a thin column of smoke rising from the forest, perhaps a mile ahead, a campfire or chimney signaling human presence. Caution warred with desperate need. After the storm, she was dangerously cold, despite her exertions. Her supplies nearly exhausted. Shelter, warmth, and food had become urgent necessities, not mere comforts. Choosing stealth over direct approach, Abigail worked her way gradually closer to the source of the smoke, using the abundant cover provided by the snow-laden forest. As she drew nearer, details emerged. Not a temporary camp as she had first supposed, but a small, permanent cabin with a corral containing 3 horses. A woodpile stood neatly stacked against one wall, and smoke curled from a stone chimney, promising warmth within. As Abigail debated her next move, the cabin door opened, spilling yellow lamplight across the snow. A figure emerged, a woman in a heavy shawl, middle-aged with streaks of grey in her dark hair. She carried a bucket to a partially frozen water barrel, broke the surface ice with practiced efficiency, and filled her container. Nothing in her. Appearance or manner suggested threat or alliance with raiders. Decision crystallized. Abigail stood from her concealment at the forest's edge, advancing slowly toward the cabin with her empty hands clearly visible. The woman spotted her immediately, freezing in surprise at the unexpected appearance of a child from the wilderness. "Help me," Abigail called, her voice cracking from cold and disuse. "Please!" The woman's shock gave way to immediate concern. She set down her water bucket and hurried forward, her expression shifting from surprise to horror as she took in Abigail's condition. The makeshift clothing, the half-frozen extremities, the gauntness of prolonged hunger. "Child, where on earth did you come from?" she asked, already guiding Abigail toward the cabin's door. "Are you alone? Are you hurt?" The rapid questions overwhelmed Abigail's ability to respond. Months of isolation had eroded her social capabilities. The simple human interaction felt overwhelming after so long in silence or in Swift Fox's taciturn company. "How far to Fort Laramie?" she managed to ask. The woman blinked in surprise at this unexpected priority. "About 15 miles northeast," she answered. "My husband runs supplies there twice weekly. He's due to go tomorrow, weather permitting." The cabin's interior struck Abigail with almost painful intensity. The blazing hearth fire, the smell of cooking food, the simple furnishings that represented unimaginable luxury after her primitive existence. A man rose from a chair by the fire, his weathered face registering the same shock his wife had shown. "Martha, who's this?" he asked, setting aside a pipe he had been smoking. "Found her outside, William," the woman replied, already guiding Abigail to the hearth. "Poor thing's nearly frozen. Asking about Fort Laramie." William studied Abigail with cautious interest, noting her unusual appearance and evident distress. "You running from something, girl?" he asked directly. The question cut through Abigail's disorientation, focusing her mind on the urgent purpose that had driven her through wilderness and storm. From her pack, she carefully extracted the oilskin-wrapped ledger and her charcoal drawings. "These men killed my family," she said, her voice stronger now as she displayed the portraits. "Montgomery and his raiders. They attack settlers and blame Indians. They attack Indians and blame settlers." She held up the ledger. "This proves everything. I'd need to get it to Major Harper at Fort Laramie." William and Martha exchanged alarmed glances, clearly recognizing the danger implicit in such accusations. The man took the drawings, examining them closely. "This one," he said, tapping the portrait of Montgomery. "I've seen him in Laramie. Calls himself a scout, but rumors follow him like buzzards." He looked up, his expression grave. "If what you're saying is true, girl, you've stepped into something deadly." "It's true," Abigail insisted. "I saw them kill everyone in our wagon train. Then I hid in the mountains until I found evidence." William returned the drawings, his decision apparent in his straightened posture. "Martha, pack food for tomorrow. Extra blankets, too." He turned to Abigail. "I'm making a supply run to Laramie at first light. You'll come with me. Major Harper's a fair man. If your evidence is solid, he'll act on it. Politics be damned." Relief washed over Abigail with such force that her knees nearly buckled. After the desperate journey from Montgomery's camp, the brutal separation from Swift Fox, the punishing travel through storm and wilderness, she had finally found allies who could help deliver the evidence to authorities capable of acting upon it. As Martha prepared a simple but hearty meal, Abigail sank into a chair by the fire, the exhaustion of her ordeal catching up all at once. The ledger remained clutched in her hands, its weight a constant reminder of both burden and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, convincing military authorities, reliving the horrors she had witnessed, potentially facing Montgomery, or his allies directly. Outside, the wilderness had fallen silent under its blanket of fresh snow. The storm passed, the stars emerging in a clearing sky. Somewhere out there, Swift Fox continued his desperate diversion, drawing Montgomery's killers away from her trail, risking everything to ensure the evidence reached Fort Laramie. As she finally surrendered to a bone-deep weariness, Abigail's thoughts drifted to the bone whistle Swift Fox had given her. 3 short calls when she reached the soldiers, a promise of reunion, of completion of their shared mission. Tomorrow would determine whether that promise could be fulfilled, whether justice might finally answer the blood spilled on that terrible dawn months ago. Dawn broke clear and cold over the snow-covered landscape. Abigail stood beside William's loaded supply wagon, watching as he made final preparations for their journey to Fort Laramie. Martha had provided her with proper winter clothing, a woolen coat cut down to fit her smaller frame, thick mittens, and a knitted cap that covered her ears. These simple comforts felt almost unnatural after months of cobbled-together garments and rabbit fur linings. More significantly, Martha had pressed a small revolver into Abigail's hands before they departed. "A girl should have protection of her own," she had said simply. The weight of the weapon in her pocket provided a strange reassurance, not so much for its lethal capacity as for what it represented, acknowledgement that her experiences had transformed her from child to survivor, worthy of the responsibilities. That transformation entailed, "Ready, girl?" William asked, securing the last crate in the wagon bed. 15 miles with good weather. Should reach the fort by midday if the road stays clear." Abigail nodded, her gaze drawn to the distant horizon where Fort Laramie waited. The culmination of her journey, the destination that might finally deliver justice for her slaughtered family and for Swift Fox's murdered kin. They set out with the rising sun at their backs, the wagon moving steadily along a well-packed trail. William proved to be a comfortable companion, neither pressing conversation nor maintaining awkward silence. He shared information about the territory they traversed, pointing out landmarks and relating brief anecdotes about the area's settlement. "Trail we're on was a trading route long before white men came," he explained as they passed a distinctive rock formation. "Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, all used it for generations. Now it's the main supply road for the fort." His casual acknowledgement of native history, stated as simple fact rather than with the usual settler's contempt or romanticization, struck Abigail as unusual. Most white frontiersmen she had encountered viewed the indigenous peoples solely as obstacles to progress or threats to security. "You don't speak of Indians like most settlers do," she observed. William's weathered face remained impassive, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Spent 3 years trapping with a Crow partner before settling here with Martha," he replied. "Man saved my life twice, taught me more about these mountains than 10 white guides could have." He glanced at her, gauging her reaction. "Reckon a man judges what he knows, not what others tell him to believe." This philosophy explained his ready acceptance of her alliance with Swift Fox. William had formed his own perspectives through direct experience rather than inherited prejudice. In this, he reminded Abigail of her father, who had similarly resisted the common settler view of natives as savages incapable of civilization. By mid-morning, they began to encounter increased traffic on the trail. Traders heading to outlying settlements, trappers bringing furs to market, and the occasional military courier moving between outposts. Each passing traveler nodded respectfully to William, clearly a known and respected figure in the territory, while casting curious glances at Abigail. She understood what they saw, a girl too thin, too watchful, too clearly marked by ordeal. Despite Martha's efforts to make her presentable, Abigail knew her appearance still carried traces of her months in the wilderness. The way she scanned continuously for threats, her tendency to move with exaggerated stealth, her unconscious classification of every stranger as potential predator or prey, all revealed the untamed creature she had become. "Fort's just beyond that ridge," William announced as they crested a small hill. "Might see patrols from here on." As if summoned by his words, riders appeared ahead, 3 soldiers in blue uniforms moving at an easy trot toward them. William slowed the wagon, his expression carefully neutral, even as his right hand shifted to rest near the rifle propped beside him. "Army patrol," he murmured, nodding toward the approaching figures. "Let me do the talking." Abigail felt her heartbeat accelerate, her body tensing with involuntary fear. After everything she'd learned about corrupt military involvement with Montgomery's raiders, these approaching soldiers represented potential threat rather than protection. She slipped a hand inside her coat, fingers closing around Martha's revolver. The patrol reined in as they drew alongside the wagon, a sergeant and two privates, their breath clouding in the winter air as they surveyed the travelers with professional assessment. "Morning, Wilson," the sergeant greeted William by name, his tone cordial but watchful. "Monthly delivery run?" "That's right, Sergeant Hayes," William answered easily. "Supplies for the sutler's store." The sergeant nodded, his gaze shifting to Abigail, curiosity evident in his expression. "Don't usually bring company on these trips." Before William could respond, Abigail made a swift decision. Rather than hiding her identity or purpose, she would test these soldiers' reactions. The direct approach might reveal allies or enemies more quickly than cautious circumspection. "I'm looking for Major Harper," she said clearly. "I have evidence about James Montgomery and the raids on settlers and Lakota camps." The effect was immediate. The sergeant's casual demeanor vanished, replaced by sharp attention. The two privates exchanged glances, hands moving subtly closer to their holstered weapons. "That's a serious claim, miss," Hayes said carefully. "Montgomery's a contracted scout with friends at Fort Kearny. He's also a murderer who profits from selling stolen goods and creating conflict between settlers and Indians," Abigail replied, maintaining steady eye contact despite her racing pulse. "I have proof." The sergeant studied her for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then, surprisingly, he turned to William. "You're vouching for this girl, Wilson?" William straightened on the wagon seat. "I am. Showed up at our cabin, half dead from the mountains. Has documents and detailed drawings that match what I've suspected about Montgomery's operation for months." Hayes nodded once, decision made. "Follow us," he ordered, turning his horse. "I'll take you directly to the major. Better not to announce your business to the whole fort." As the patrol escorted them toward Fort Laramie, Abigail felt a complex wave of emotions. Relief that these soldiers appeared to be honest men, anxiety about the confrontation to come, and beneath it all, a gnawing worry about Swift Fox's fate. Had he escaped Montgomery's hunters? Was he even now working his way toward Fort Laramie to reunite with her as promised? Fort Laramie appeared imposing even from a distance, its palisade walls standing stark against the winter landscape, the American flag snapping in the cold breeze above the central blockhouse. As they approached, Abigail could see activity within and around the fortification, soldiers drilling in an open area, civilian workers moving between buildings, supply wagons being loaded or unloaded. Rather than entering through the main gates, Sergeant Hayes led them to a less conspicuous side entrance, where guards saluted and allowed them to pass without inspection. They proceeded directly to a two-story building set apart from the barracks and enlisted men's quarters. Major Harper's office, Hayes explained, dismounting and gesturing for them to follow. "He'll want to hear this privately before involving others." The sergeant led them through a sparse anteroom where a young lieutenant looked up in surprise from paperwork. "These folks need to see the major immediately," Hayes stated. "Confidential matter regarding the territorial raids." The lieutenant hesitated only briefly before knocking on an inner door. At the muffled response from within, he opened it and announced their presence. "Sergeant Hayes with civilians bringing information about the raid, sir." "Send them in." The voice from within carried the crisp authority of long command. Major William Harper proved to be a man of medium height, with iron-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon with military precision. He rose from behind a desk cluttered with maps and reports, gesturing toward chairs positioned before it. "Sergeant Hayes rarely interrupts my morning without good reason," he said, remaining standing until Abigail and William had seated themselves. "I assume this matter warrants immediate attention." Before either could respond, the Major's gaze settled on Abigail with sudden intensity. "You look familiar, young lady," he said, his brow furrowing. "Have we met?" "No, sir," Abigail replied, "but you might recognize me from descriptions of the Caldwell wagon train massacre. I'm Abigail Richardson. I was gathering firewood when the raiders attacked. I'm the only survivor." Harper's expression shifted from curiosity to shock. "My God," he murmured. "We sent 3 search parties when we found the burned wagons, found 23 bodies, but reports indicated 24 settlers." His gaze sharpened. "You've been missing for more than 3 months. Where have you been?" "Hiding in the mountains," Abigail answered simply. "I found a cave, learned to survive. Then a Lakota scout named Swift Fox found me. He was hunting the same men who attacked our wagon train, men who had killed his sister's family while disguised as soldiers." Harper's eyes narrowed at the mention of Swift Fox. "I know him. Contracted with us last spring as a guide. Excellent tracker, but disappeared after his sister's family was killed." He studied Abigail with new interest. "Continue." With remarkable composure for one so young, Abigail recounted her experiences, the initial attack, her months of solitary survival, Swift Fox's appearance, and most importantly, their discovery of Montgomery's camp and the ledger documenting his criminal enterprise. As she spoke, she removed the oilskin-wrapped book from her pack and placed it on Harper's desk. "Everything is recorded here. Dates of attacks, whether they were disguised as Indians or soldiers, what they stole, and who received payments afterward." Harper opened the ledger, his expression hardening as he scanned the contents. "Captain Lewis's name appears frequently," he noted, referring to the officer from Fort Kearny whom Abigail had seen meeting with Montgomery. "He's directly involved," Abigail confirmed. "Swift Fox and I saw him at Montgomery's camp, planning another raid on the Jenkins settlement." Harper continued reading, occasionally making notes on a separate sheet of paper. His face revealed little, but the tightening of his jaw and the controlled precision of his movements suggested growing anger. When he finally looked up, his eyes had turned to flint. "These accusations implicate not just Montgomery and his men, but several military officers, 3 Indian agents, and a territorial judge." He tapped the ledger. "If verified, this represents conspiracy at a level that threatens the entire peace process with the Lakota and Cheyenne nations." "It can be verified," William spoke up for the first time since entering Harper's office. "I've seen one of Montgomery's men operating as a soldier at Fort Kearny. The man who calls himself Davis, when in uniform, he's the red-bearded raider in the girl's drawings." Abigail removed her charcoal portraits from the pack, spreading them on the desk beside the ledger. Harper examined them carefully, his expression darkening further as he recognized faces. "This man," he said, tapping the portrait of Montgomery, "has dined in my officer's mess, presented himself as a concerned citizen, aiding military efforts to maintain peace." His finger moved to another drawing. "And this one, Rayburn, applied for a civilian scout position here last fall." The major rose abruptly, moving to the office door. "Lieutenant," he called to the young officer in the anteroom, "send runners for Captain Reynolds and Lieutenant Marshall. Immediate attendance, full discretion." He turned back to Abigail and William. "I need my most trusted officers for what comes next." While they waited, Harper asked Abigail to describe Montgomery's camp in detail, its layout, defenses, number of men, and the surrounding terrain. She did so with a precision that clearly impressed the major, her months in the wilderness having honed her observational skills to remarkable sharpness. "And Swift Fox?" Harper asked when she had finished. "Where is he now?" "We separated when Montgomery's men pursued us, Abigail explained, her voice tightening slightly. He created a false trail to draw them away, while I brought the evidence here. He gave me this. She removed the bone whistle from around her neck, said to blow 3 short calls when I reached the fort and he would find me. Harper studied. The whistle with recognition. Lakota signal call, he confirmed, used to identify friendly approaches during joint operations. His expression softened marginally. Swift Fox took a considerable risk helping you. Most Lakota would have little reason to trust that justice would come from a military fort. Before Abigail could respond, the office door opened to admit 2 officers, a captain in his 40s with a weathered face that suggested extensive field service, and a younger lieutenant whose alert eyes immediately assessed everyone in the room. Gentlemen, Harper addressed them without preamble, we have a situation requiring immediate and discreet action. This young lady has brought evidence implicating James Montgomery and several military personnel in a conspiracy to incite conflict between settlers and native tribes for personal profit. Both officers displayed momentary surprise before professionalism reasserted itself. Captain Reynolds moved immediately to examine the ledger Harper indicated, while Lieutenant Marshall studied Abigail's drawings with increasing concern. I recognize at least 6 of these men, Marshall stated. 3 have visited the fort in various capacities over the past year. And these entries match suspicious incidents we've been tracking for months, Reynolds added, looking up from the ledger. The timing of the Blackwater Creek attack on settlers corresponds exactly with Montgomery's presence at Fort Kearney as a consultant on Indian affairs. Harper nodded grimly. My thoughts exactly. He turned to the lieutenant. Marshal, I want arrest parties assembled, trusted men only. We move on this immediately before word can spread. Sir, Marshall acknowledged, already moving toward the door. Reynolds, Harper continued, prepare dispatches for territorial headquarters and Washington. This goes beyond our jurisdiction alone. We'll need federal marshals and possibly a military tribunal. As the officers departed to execute these orders, Harper returned his attention to Abigail. Miss Richardson, your testimony will be essential. In the days to come, I'd like you to remain at the fort under protection until these men are apprehended. Abigail hesitated, her hand moving unconsciously to the bone whistle. Sir, Swift Fox risked everything to help me. He's still out there, possibly being hunted by Montgomery's men. Harper considered this, then nodded with evident respect for her loyalty. We'll send a patrol to sweep the approaches to the fort. If he's attempting to reach us, they'll find him. He gestured toward a window overlooking the parade ground. In the meantime, you may signal from the southwest watchtower. If he's near, enough to hear, he'll know the fort hasn't turned against him. The events of the next hours passed in a blur of activity. William departed to deliver his supplies, promising to return and check on Abigail before heading back to his cabin. A kindly officer's wife named Mrs. Thornton was summoned to provide Abigail with proper quarters and fresh clothing. Patrols rode out in carefully coordinated patterns, some tasked with apprehending identified conspirators, others with securing the approaches to the fort against possible retaliation from Montgomery's remaining men. Throughout, Abigail found herself treated with a mixture of awe and compassion by those who learned pieces of her story. The officers marveled at her wilderness survival and detailed evidence. The women clucked over her thinness and the lingering wildness in her eyes. The enlisted men regarded her with a sort of protective reverence, as if she represented something, innocence, perhaps worth defending despite its terrible wounding, yet it was isolation of a different sort. Among these well-meaning people, Abigail felt acutely the distance between their ordered world and the one she had inhabited. They could not truly comprehend what it meant to watch your family slaughtered, to survive for months on the knife edge, between life and death, to form an alliance across the seemingly unbridgeable divide of culture and history. In the late afternoon, escorted by a young corporal assigned as her guard, Abigail climbed the steps to the southwest watchtower. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape surrounding the fort. From this elevation, she could see for miles in every direction, the river valley stretching northward, the foothills rising. To the west, the vast prairie rolling eastward toward distant settlements. The corporal stood respectfully aside as Abigail removed the bone whistle from around her neck. Taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, she blew 3 short, clear notes, the signal Swift Fox had instructed her to make upon reaching safety. The sound carried in the still afternoon, echoing faintly off distant slopes. She waited, scanning the approaches to the fort, with the heightened perception that months in the wilderness had instilled in her. For long minutes, there was nothing. Only the typical movements of patrols, the occasional wildlife, the wind stirring bare tree branches. Then, as the sun touched the western mountains, she saw it, a lone figure emerging from the tree line far beyond the fort's formal boundaries. Even at this distance, she recognized the distinctive way he moved, efficient and fluid, at home in the wilderness in a way few men could match. "Corporal," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "tell Major Harper that Swift Fox is approaching." From the southwest ridge, the young soldier peered in the direction she indicated, clearly unable to discern what her wilderness-trained eyes had spotted. Nevertheless, he hurried to relay her message, leaving Abigail alone in the watchtower, her gaze fixed on the approaching figure. By the time Swift Fox reached the open ground surrounding the fort, a small party had assembled at the southwest gate to meet him. Major Harper, Lieutenant Marshall, and Abigail herself, still looking somewhat incongruous in the borrowed dress Mrs. Thornton had provided. Swift Fox approached with characteristic caution, his expression revealing nothing. As he assessed the waiting group, he had clearly endured his own ordeal since their separation. His clothing was torn in places, a crude bandage wrapped one forearm, his face leaner than Abigail remembered. Yet he moved with the same controlled power, his eyes missing nothing. When he stopped a respectful distance from the gate, Major Harper stepped forward, deliberately alone and with empty hands clearly visible. "Swift Fox," he called in a carrying voice, "you are welcome at Fort Laramie. The girl is safe. Your evidence has been received." For a long moment, Swift Fox remained motionless, weighing Harper's words against the considerable history of broken promises and betrayals his people had experienced at the hands of military authorities. Then his gaze found Abigail, and something in her expression, perhaps the simple fact of her freedom and apparent well-being, seemed to resolve his doubts. He covered the remaining distance with measured strides, stopping before Harper with dignified formality. "Major," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "The girl brought the proof?" "She did," Harper confirmed. "Arrest parties have already departed. Montgomery will face justice, as will his conspirators in uniform." He extended his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. "Fort Laramie acknowledges its debt to you both." Swift Fox regarded the offered hand briefly before accepting it. The gesture represented more than personal acknowledgement. It was recognition from a military authority that a Lakota warrior had acted righteously, had protected a white child, had served the cause of justice across the boundaries that typically divided their peoples. With formalities observed, Swift Fox turned to Abigail, his normally impassive features softening as he took in her transformation from wilderness survivor to something approaching a proper frontier girl. "Strong spirit," he said simply, using the name he had given her in acknowledgement of her resilience. "You succeeded." "We succeeded," Abigail corrected, returning the medicine pouch she had carried since their first days together. "I kept it safe, as promised." Swift Fox accepted the pouch, then surprised everyone present by placing it back around Abigail's neck. "Keep it," he said. "You have earned its protection." As they entered the fort together, the Lakota scout and the orphaned settler girl, flanked by military officers in an unprecedented tableau of cooperation, Abigail felt the weight of symbolic importance their unlikely alliance had assumed. To those watching, they represented something many had thought impossible, a bridge between worlds that history and violence had driven apart. Yet to Abigail, the moment carried a more personal significance. For months after the massacre, she had existed in a liminal space, neither fully part of the world she had lost, nor able to return completely to the society that had shaped her. In Swift Fox, she had found someone who understood that borderland existence, who had shown her that strength could be found in the ability to move between worlds rather than belonging fully to either. Over the following days, as Montgomery and his conspirators were brought to the fort in chains and formal proceedings began, Abigail found her role shifting from survivor to witness. Her testimony, supported by her remarkable charcoal drawings, provided irrefutable evidence that even Montgomery's powerful allies could not dismiss. The ledger they had risked their lives to obtain revealed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, implicating officials who had profited from the bloodshed they had officially condemned. Swift Fox, too, found unexpected respect within the fort's walls. Major Harper, recognizing both his service and his skill, offered him a permanent position as liaison between Fort Laramie and the Lakota bands, a bridge builder whose understanding of both cultures might help prevent future conflict. It was an unprecedented role for a native warrior, acknowledging the value of his perspective rather than demanding his assimilation. When the formal tribunal finally convened, with representatives from Washington in attendance, Abigail stood before them with quiet dignity, recounting her experiences with a clarity and precision that silenced even the most skeptical observers. Beside her, Swift Fox offered complimentary testimony, his measured words carrying the weight of a people too often dismissed as incapable of participating in civilized justice. The tribunal's verdict came swiftly. Montgomery and his primary accomplices were sentenced to hang for murder and treason. The corrupt military officers faced dishonorable discharge and imprisonment. The territorial officials implicated in the conspiracy were removed from office, their cases referred to federal courts for prosecution. It was justice, as complete as the frontier could offer. Yet, as Abigail watched Montgomery led away to await execution, she felt no triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement that a necessary closure had been achieved. The dead remained dead. The lost months of fear and isolation couldn't be reclaimed. The innocence shattered by violence couldn't be restored. On her final night at Fort Laramie, before departing for her uncle's home in Oregon, Abigail joined Swift Fox on the fort's southwestern wall. The winter stars spread across the sky in breathtaking clarity, the same stars that had watched over her solitary cave, that had guided his tracking, that had witnessed both atrocity and alliance beneath their indifferent light. "What will you do now?" she asked, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Swift Fox gazed toward the distant mountains where they had formed their unlikely partnership. "Continue as a bridge between peoples," he replied. "Work with Major Harper, perhaps prevent other children from losing families to hatred and greed." Abigail nodded, understanding the importance of the role he had accepted, not a surrender of identity, but an expansion of purpose. "My uncle writes that I can attend school in Oregon," she said. "Learn to draw properly, with real materials." A rare smile touched Swift Fox's features. "Already draw the truth better than most. Powerful medicine in your hands." As they stood, in companionable silence, watching the moonlight transform the snow-covered landscape into a terrain of silver and shadow, Abigail realized that the girl who had hidden in mountain caves had re-emerged, forever changed, but carrying within her the strength of both worlds, the resilience she had found in wilderness solitude, and the justice she now sought through human community. The drawings that had bridged her. Isolation to Swift Fox's quest for vengeance had formed another bridge, between a blood-soaked past and the possibility of a future where truth might prevail over convenient lies. Between worlds that preferred to remain divided, but might yet find common ground through those willing to walk the boundaries between them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.